Okay, so again, this alliance that we've been talking about between the British and the Zionists, this is what really starts to create the environment that allows for the Nakba, right? It wasn't a coincidence that just as soon as the British mandate expired, that the Zionists were ready to steal the land, right, and do a big land grab right at that moment, right? These things were being built, and again, they were strategized around. They were sending Zionists to go spy on Arab villages and to understand the layout of all the lands. And so, again, a lot of the things that we already know, but here, again, we arrive in 1948. We see mass dispossession and ethnic cleansing. And we see really here the consolidation of Zionist power, right? Now they're consolidating their power and really stepping in place of where there were them and the British. Now it's the Zionists trying to take more control. And so this obviously had world-destroying effects across all of Palestinian life. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are dispossessed from their lands and their homes. There becomes these two processes of alienation and extraction, meaning the inability to maintain your connection to the land that sustains you, and that farms are no longer accessible, homes are now replaced by Jewish settlers. Extraction in this case means the theft of resources, including labor, to help enrich the Zionist project, right? And so again, we see hundreds of thousands of people being displaced to Lebanon, to Syria, to Jordan, to Egypt. By 1948, 2/3 of Palestinians are the rural peasant class who would go on to fill the majority of post-Nakba refugee camps. So again, we see this connection between the peasant class and the ruling class being able to take advantage of things, while the peasant class is the one fighting, is the one resisting, is the one trying to maintain hold of their land, and they're also the ones being obviously punished for doing that. Again, we're beginning to see this, or continuing to see this kind of class betrayal. So prior to 1948, the British control of Palestine had shifted the balance of power in favor of Zionists and at the expense of Palestinians. And so here in 1947, we see the UN partition resolution, which proposed the creation of a Jewish state on more than half of Mandate Palestine, even though at the time, Jewish people comprised less than 1/3 of the population, and they only owned less than 7% of the land. And yet this partition plan made it such that more than half of the land would be partitioned as a Jewish state. And so this, this partition was adopted with 33 votes in favor, 13 votes against, and 10 abstentions. And some of these, it's a little bit squished, the picture, but we see it kind of split into 3 areas. The Galilee, which includes Safed and Bisan, and then the coastal areas of Haifa, Jaffa, and then the Nakba as well.
Just a little bit about the forces, the Zionist military forces that carried out the Nakba. Of course, always remembering with the support of the British. So we had the Haganah and the Irgun, which were Zionist terror forces that were established in the 1920s, and actually were trained by the British to fight in World War I earlier. And so, and the Irgun was also established in the 30s. It was an offshoot of the Haganah. And both of these groups were absorbed into the IDF. They comprised the IDF. The Irgun is actually best known for committing the Deir Yassin massacre. And then there's the Stern Gang, which was an offshoot of the Irgun. They're all the same, they're all Zionist terror forces. But the Stern Gang had the goal of evicting the British authorities from Palestine in their war of liberation, to have unrestricted Jewish settlement. And actually, the Stern Gang was allied with fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, offering to fight alongside them against the British in exchange for the transfer of Jews from Nazi-occupied Europe to Palestine. We don't have time to get into this other alliance between Nazism and Zionism, but it's a very interesting history that is, completely logical when you think about.
What about the Muslim?
Okay. So, sorry, we're not gonna take questions now. So the Nakba now will have Plan Dalit and Operation Naqshon. These are two of the kind of biggest massacres or ethnic cleansing plans, very similar to what we are seeing to this day. So Plan Dalit was implemented. In 1948 was and one of the noteworthy plans because the goal of this was to expand Jewish-held areas beyond those allocated to the proposed Zionist state. Even in the partition plan, that even this partition plan itself, the Arabs and the Palestinians rejected, and so it was an attempt to seize as much territory as possible before the termination of the British mandate or the British occupation. And so this included attacks and massacres in Deir Yassin, Kastel, Haifa, and Jaffa. Operation Naqshon was the first kind of phase of Plan Dalit or Plan D, which is the extermination plan. And it was to occupy and ethnically cleanse the Palestinian villages that lay on both sides of the Jaffa-Jerusalem road. And this plan would assure that Jewish forces had access to Jerusalem from the coast, while also splitting the central mass of the state assigned to the Palestinians under the UN plan. So this was all like strategies placed in to carry out the Nakba. Now we'll go into kind of briefly the fall of major Palestinian cities. It's always important for us to remember the history of our villages and towns in 1948 that are, were occupied, that are colonized and are occupied to this day. Haifa was is a Palestinian city that kind of the fall of Haifa represents the beginning of the end of this phase of war because it was a huge and a major hub of Palestinian society. And it was included in the Zionist state by the UN partition plan because it was a principal port of Palestine. It's really interesting history of the port, but Haifa had a population of 140,000 Palestinians, and the British forces were using Haifa at this point as a point of assembly for forces to gather and take off to Britain, and and for trade, and it was really important for their interests. And so on April 21st, the Haganah launched its ground assault, combining physical and psychological warfare continuously through the evening of April 22nd. And they were given directions to, quote unquote, kill any Arab you encounter, set fire on all flammable objects, and force open doors with explosives. When the Haganah command learned that the Arab authorities were calling for civilians to gather for shelter in the old marketplace in Haifa, 3-inch mortars were ordered to shell the marketplace to kill them. Again, continuity of Zionist terror. We see the way that they attacking civilians, schools, hospitals, mosques, safe roads to this day, and it's just part of what Zionism requires for its genocidal goal to genocide the Palestinian people. So another important phase or the Nakba was the exodus from Lidda and Ramle, where 50,000 to 70,000 Palestinians were forcibly expelled when Israeli troops came into this area. And Lidda and Ramle was also really important because it sat on the intersection of Palestine's main north and south, east and west roads. The Israeli forces began bombing the towns to induce civilian flights, and then the IDF was given an order to, quote unquote, that the inhabitants of Lidda must be expelled quickly without attention to age. And they were following this, command from the IDF, there was what has been called the Nidda Death March, where Israel gave the order to expel the Palestinians and march them to the Jordan-controlled West Bank. Many Palestinians died along the route, and this is where you see images of pregnant women marching with their children, being forced out of their homes. So this is what Palestinians are up against. They're up against Western imperialism, as embodied by the British. They're up against the Zionists, and they're up against Arab reactionary forces like the Arab elites who are colluding with the Western and Zionist forces to aid the imperialist project. And here is the result of the colonization process of the land. I know that was really a quick recap of a really important history that maybe sometime we can come back and do just the history of Nakba. But yeah, I have a small video for you guys. Yeah, this video represents the dispossession that occurred between the periods that are on the video.
So now we're seeing like the beginning of settlements, right? The revolts would be happening now in 1930s. We're getting into the 40s, and in 1947 here we'll see the UN partition plan, right? So there's that, and then 1948, and it encroaches more on Palestinian lands. And we see expulsions there. And then 1967 and later on we'll get into the Oslo Accords as well in 1993 and 1995. But we'll just to give a kind of recap here. Okay. So as you can see, with hundreds of thousands displaced, there is a pronounced fragmentation in Palestinian life and resistance. Everything about Zionism is about population management on top of land expropriation. So the resistance seeks to overcome this through institutions that span a scattered geography, and often actually through waging the struggle outside the borders of Palestine. And of course, why do we have to wage a struggle outside the borders of Palestine? Because hundreds of thousands of people have been expelled now, to Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, so on. So Palestinians fought from Jordan and from Lebanon to reclaim their land, as you will see. And what we'll see, or what we'll try to emphasize here as well, is that the Palestinian struggle is not just isolated to the lands of historical Palestine. At times it shifts, but it's fought wherever Palestinians and their allies live and work. And in its core, then, Palestinians are fighting for total liberation, the return of land, and the return of people to their land. And so, I think, honestly, like it's difficult to be teaching this in this moment, but you can see here from these pictures, right? And we've all seen. The pictures that have been coming out of Gaza in the past few weeks, that this genocidal agenda is clearer than ever. The continued Nakba is the goal of the Zionist entity, and that's clearer than ever. And so, we have the picture in 1948 of people leaving their homes and having to set up camps, and we have the picture from 2023 of people leaving their homes and having to set up camps. And as we know now, almost half the housing infrastructure, if not more, in Gaza has been demolished. And so, these are the conditions our people are living in, and we'll continue to see, our people's resistance, no matter the amount of repression that they're facing. And it's important to know that there are still hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza and in northern Gaza facing the direct repression of the Zionist invasion of Gaza. And so many more, over 1 million, that have been displaced to a different part of Gaza. And imagine this as well, and as we know from learning about the Nakba and so on, that the population of Gaza was already largely a refugee population, refugeed from other parts of Palestine into the Gaza Strip, and now moved again.
Yeah, and also on that note, kind of, we've been talking about how those who had led the struggle, in 1936 were peasants who were, kicked off of their land, who were dispossessed. Gaza is the heart of our struggle. It's the heart of the resistance, and 70% of the people who live in Gaza are dispossessed, are refugees who were kicked off of their land, just right around Gaza, and the settlements surrounding Gaza. And so it's just important for us to kind of continue to understand the link between, the dispossession from land and, the struggle, the national liberation struggle and the resistance. So with that, we're gonna do an even briefer history of the PLO. The PLO is the Palestinian Liberation Organization. I'm sure you've all heard of it. And like Lamis was saying, at this moment in 1964, the PLO forms, and it's because there's converging interests. There's Arab regimes that are, starting to see how Zionism is also a threat to their own interests. You have Zionist plans to redivert water from Syria into Palestine and Egypt. You also have some of the more reactionary Arab states getting worried about the growing national liberation, the Palestinian national liberation movement. And at the same time, you also have the Palestinian resistance and the Palestinian struggle trying to consolidate after the Nakba, to regroup once again, after they had this organized strategy revolution in the 30s that was, systematically dismantled, and then there's an attempt to regroup, to refocus on the national liberation struggle, to counter the UN partition plan, to counter, attempts to reduce this to, something that it is not, which is, yeah. So, the establishment of the PLO, it marked a significant turning point in Palestinian history, and it was essential in maintaining and developing Palestinian national identity at the time. You had in 1964 the Palestinian National Charter and the Basic Law, which formulated the idea of a Palestinian identity and the organizational framework for this identity. The National Charter outlined the goals and the principles of the PLO, and the Basic Law is the PLO's constitution. And the PLO was established at the first Arab Summit by other Arab nations to function independently of Arab governments. I'm not going to go too much into the leaders and so forth. If you guys have questions, we can talk about it afterwards. But it's just sort of important to kind of understand that the structures in the PLO. There was a National Council. The National Council, which had authority, supreme authority, and formulated policies and programs. Then there was the Central Council, which implemented the resolutions. And then there was the Executive Committee, which had like official representatives of Palestinians, supervisors of the PLO, executive financial policies, and a lot of technical stuff. The history, the kind of more interesting history of the PLO gets, at least to me, is when it gets into the Palestinian Revolution in Lebanon stuff, which we actually won't get into too much. But that brings us to the Nexa, also known as the setback. So the ideological, let's say, the importance of Nexa for how we view it here is to emphasize two things, which is that the Arab dimension of the struggle, that this is a struggle for all Arab, and all free people, but especially all Arab, and also that Zionism is an expansionist ideology. Can anyone tell me does anyone know what happened, like which territories were occupied in the Nexa?
The north, the part that Israel took part, which is the Dafa al-Gharbiyya now, or the what we call it, West Bank now. Yeah, 1967.
What about outside of Palestine? Oh, go ahead. Say one.
No, I had someone else.
All right, go on the back.
The Sinai Peninsula
Yeah.
and the Golan Heights.
One more.
And then southern parts of southern Lebanon.
Yeah, people always forget that. I'm Lebanese. Okay, yeah. So at this point, the Zionists, they're seeing the Arabs reconsolidate, with the formation of the PLO, and just like they do every time, they are looking for ways to cut this, to break this up, to actually kind of, pit different Arab interests against each other. And that comes up in them occupying the Golan, Syria, Mazara, Sheba farms in the south, and the Sinai Peninsula, and the West Bank, of course. And so they sorry, I just said the same thing. So part of the reasons for this expansion, to help you understand this history, is that the struggle against Zionism, and it's actually in this moment where U.S. imperialism becomes more key. The U.S. always played a role in Zionism, and they actually, have settlements that they established, prior to 1948, American exclusive sort of settlements, really interesting history around that. But the Americans became more like officially and like in policy involved in supporting the Zionist entity in 1967. And it has to do with their regional and territorial ambitions. The Zionists and the U.S. imperialists, for that matter, they don't see the Arab world as distinct from the Palestinian lands that they occupy. They're, even, if you think of the map of what some Zionists call Greater Israel, it includes parts of Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. And, now even, in this current assault on Gaza, you have major, figures, IDF figures, Zionist figures going off and saying things like, we'll reoccupy Lebanon and Syria, it's our land, etc. This shouldn't be shocking to us. This is part of the Zionist ideology. And this helps us to situate the Palestinian struggle as part of the larger Arab anti-imperialist struggle that is fighting against, the three distinct enemies of Zionism, Western imperialism, and Arab reactionary regimes. So, okay, for time's purpose, maybe I'll quickly go over the strategic importance of the specific areas they occupy, just to always remind us of like the interests, the material interests at stake. The West Bank was strategic because it increased Israel's strategic depth, and as in they increased the distance between borders and metropolitan cities. They had control over the urban areas. The occupation of Gaza and the Sinai was really important because of its proximity to the Suez Canal, and this was for interest for the U.S., Britain, and France, as well as the Straits of Tiran. And the Golan, the Golan Heights, was strategic because it's the highest regional point, so it gave dominance over Syria and also water resources. And finally, Lebanon, the Mazara the Sheba farms, because of the water in Lebanon. The Litani River was always a really important resource for the Zionists, especially because Palestine does not have that much water. And also because of a lot of the refugees that were all across the area in kind of growing consolidation. So yeah.
Right. So again, some other outcomes of 1967. Again, we see the displacement of at least 250,000 Palestinians. So another set of refugees that were created either within other areas of Palestine or displaced to, again, Lebanon, Jordan, and so on. And obviously this has severe consequences, as you can imagine, for the Palestinian resistance as well, right? Because of the defeat of the Arab armies. The resistance understood that what was needed was a new type of warfare, a people's war, primarily waged along the border regions of Palestine. And so again, we see this increased Zionist territorial control, which is again, part of fulfilling the imperialist interests in the region, and seeing more Palestinians dispossessed of their land and exiled. And the response to this is that the Palestinian resistance turns to a strategy of guerrilla warfare, and led by Palestinians that are in exile. in these areas, that have now become refugees in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. And out of this, as well, as we'll see in a second, kind of the thing that brings like a ceasefire to the 1967 to the Naksa is the UN Resolution 242, which we'll get into in a second. But the thing about this is that this resolution, in order, like I was saying, like kind of this attack on the other Arab lands and trying to sow discord amongst Arabs, and so that there's less unity among them and less of a chance for them to be able to actually work together to take on Zionists. So the UN resolution kind of embeds this within it because it lays the groundwork for any sort of quote-unquote peace process, right? Things that we know that don't actually bring about peace, so we will talk about a little bit later. But it lays really the groundwork. They use the Naksa 1967 to be able to lay the groundwork to have kind of a chokehold on other Arab countries in the region. And so the UN resolution 242, brings a ceasefire, but it also basically implies that the other Arab countries that agree to it will recognize an Israeli state. And they don't all agree to it right away, but eventually, again, because they've targeted now the Golan, they've targeted parts of Jordan and so on, this brings other Arab countries into kind of really laying the groundwork for them to negotiate with the Zionists, something they wouldn't do before, and to accept, quote unquote peace processes that we know don't actually, bring about peace. And except in Lebanon, I want you all to know that Nai did not, that Lebanon did not negotiate with Zionists. But also, and out of this, part two is where we start to see like the formation of a stronger Palestinian left, right? That rejects these types of capitulation and this type of negotiation with the Zionists. Moving on from then, so now we're moving on through history. Obviously, there's a lot that we're skipping, and inshallah, we'll be able to do more together soon. But yeah, we'll do a part two, but more like a prequel, yeah. Now we're up to 1982, right? So we've gone through the Naksa in 1967. There's the outcomes of that, and again, we're going to quickly cover some more of these pieces of this critical history, but again, more people are displaced, right, to Lebanon especially, and the PLO and the leadership starts to be concentrated within Lebanon. So of course, what do the Zionists want to do? Attack that, right? And they're going to invade Lebanon in 1982, trying to follow the PLO and pushing them out of Lebanon, making sure that they don't have the power to actually rise up against the Zionist entity. And so in 1982, they invaded Lebanon to drive out the PLO, and they also occupied South Lebanon in the process, a small part of which is still occupied to this day. But in addition to that, Lebanon also had its own, obviously, benefits, its own material, material and resources that the Zionists and the imperialists wanted to take advantage of. And it explains to this day too why Lebanon was attacked multiple times throughout the 80s and 90s, but even to this day.
Even before the PLO came to Lebanon.
So what happens then after the invasion of Lebanon? Does anyone know where the PLO ends up, where they are exiled to? To Tunis, yeah, to Tunisia, exactly. And so the whole strategy for the resistance, at the time had to do with geographical proximity. And that meant if you're in Lebanon, you're bordering Palestine, right? So you're able to wage guerrilla warfare. But obviously, if you're in Tunis, if you're in Tunisia, that can't happen, right? So the exile of the PLO from Beirut in 1982, it really cut them off from their base. And then this again lays the groundwork for more ways that the Zionists will try to negotiate and entrench themselves into more and more Palestinian land, because now there isn't this concentrated group and leadership that exists in a geographical proximity. So in the early 80s, there had to be a new shift in the strategy of resistance. And this meant, okay, if we can't border anymore, we have to think about where is the resistance going to shift to? It's going to shift to the West Bank and Gaza, actually. So now, where it was in surrounding areas, we have to kind of shift again and think about, okay, so how can we, how are the Palestinians going to be able to kind of wage the resistance from within Palestine, from within the West Bank and Gaza? And so, this becomes really crucial, obviously, after 1982. And again, just to recap all of this a little bit, the further they're pushed away, the more we have to turn inwards into Palestine. And this actually lays the groundwork then for the first big revolt, again, since the 30s and so on, that we'll see, which is, does anyone know? Yeah, the first Intifada, good. Which actually, does anyone know the spark of the first Intifada, from which refugee camp it started in? No. It is in Gaza, Jabali refugee camp, which obviously, we've all seen how heavily targeted it's been in the past few weeks. And so I'll pass it back.
So the first Intifada, here's just a quote, I'll read it. Keep in mind, they have guns, we have rocks. If your heart is from a rock, no matter what they do to it, it remains in shape, it remains a rock. This is from a resistance fighter. And so the first Intifada, also known as the Intifada of rocks, or the Intifada of stones, we're gonna start off with a nice video from a film called Naila and the Uprising.
ال 67 كانت في البداية بدأت الحرب والاحتلال الإسرائيلي. بهذاك الوقت كان الاحتلال موجود في الشوارع. سيارات الجيش باستمرار موجودة في كل أزقة البلد. سنة 69 كنا في المدرسة الابتدائية والمدرسة مش كثير بعيدة عن بيتنا. أنا كنت حوالي 8 سنين. كان شهر 10 وكنا في بنسميها الفرصة، هي الساعة 10 يطلعونا الفرصة. سمعنا صوت تفجيرات كبيرة. قلق المدير على الوضع خلاها تبعث الآتمة في المدرسة تسأل شو السبب. رجعت قالت للمديرة بيت إبراهيم عايش هدول يموت. طبعا الآتمة ما بتعرف أنا بنت إبراهيم عايش وإلي 4 أخوات في المدرسة. شفنا كيف بيتنا مهدوم من النص. بذكر عيون أبوي قديش كانت حزينة. أعتقد هذه المسائل زرعت عندي يعني العداء إلى الاحتلال.
This is what the occupation is all about. There are 2 sets of laws here. Jews live under Israeli civilian justice. Arabs are under the thumb of the military, second-class citizens in their own land. Palestinians aren't allowed to compete with Israeli enterprise. They can't even grow or sell vegetables without a permit. Arabs can't travel into Israel or abroad without a permit. They can't carry weapons as Israeli civilians do. Every day, Arabs are arrested for resisting the occupation. This can happen anytime, anywhere, and often.
يعني تكريس واقع الاحتلال بكل معنى الكلمة. إسرائيل كانت مسيطرة على كل مناحي حياتنا. المدارس كانت تابعة للإدارة المدنية بهذيك الفترة، وحتى يمكن المناهج كان مكتوب تحت الإدارة المدنية إذا بتذكر يعني. في مرحلة الثانوية أعتقد الأمور بلشت شوي تصير أوضح بالنسبة لإلي. في خلاص واحد من هذا الشيء، الخلاص بدنا نخلص من الاحتلال. الخلاص من الاحتلال مش معناته خنوعنا وإنه كل واحد يخاف يقعد في بيته.
Thank you. So this is a really brief, if you have time to watch at some point. So we're actually going to go also kind of quickly through the first intifada. So Naila and the uprising, Naila. Because we're going to go through this a bit because we want to also kind of get to talking about Gaza. So in this video we had a clip, she talked about the conditions that were created by 1967. And actually the woman speaking, Naila Ayash, is the General Director of the Women's Affairs Committee in Gaza in the 1980s. And as we'll see in the first Intifada, the different committees, including the women's committees, were really, really central to keeping the Intifada going, to having like organized revolution. And for Naila, as we see, 1967 meant the destruction of her home and the encroachment of Zionist occupation. And ultimately, what Naila comes to understand from the political conditions of her upbringing is that there is only one solution, and that is Intifada, revolution. So Palestinians choose to resist based off of their personal and material, calculations of the situation. And so, to understand the conditions, we need to understand three major things, and that's land, labor, and captive market. So quickly, with land, by the 1970s, half of the land in the West Bank was already taken, was settled, or was inaccessible to Palestinians. And many Palestinians historically depended on agriculture for sustaining their lives and their communities. As a result, the Zionists targeted this. We saw the same thing, remember, when we talked about the 1936 revolt, where the British, alienated the Palestinian peasantry from their land, and which was their source of livelihood, forcing them to move into the cities where they had control more over the capitalist captive market. With labor, because people were losing their land and their agriculture where they would produce the food and their livelihood, and also their water resources, because actually the Zionist entity controlled like 85% of water production at this point. They also lost their ability to sell products. And so as a result, Palestinians were forced to work in the Zionist entity to become seasonal surplus labor, which was like cheap, mobile, not organized labor force. It's very, what's the word? Precarious, sometimes you'll have work, sometimes you won't. You could be detained. You have to go at 3 a.m. You stand in for hours. A lot of the workers that were detained on October 7th were workers in Gaza going to work in the Zionist entity as a result of what happened in 1967. And there's an estimate of over 120,000 Palestinians who actually work in the Zionist entity, who work to build settlements, who work to build the walls. And it's through the Zionist entity developed a system of law and regulations that enabled them to, control the lives of Palestinians through the checkpoints that govern them every day when they go to work. And it was an attempt to create a class that would be dependent on the Zionist entity, economically, financially, all those ways. And lastly, the captive market is, a way that the Zionists would produce cheaper goods, in a way forcing Palestinians to have to rely and purchase Zionist goods. And on top of that, they added a system of taxation, tariffs, that also sought to keep Palestinians dependent, similar to what the British did in the 30s. So, we see how they're learning the tactics, again, continuity. So the situation was very difficult for Palestinians, and the Palestinians were forced with, revolting or have revolution against these systems. How they did that was through popular committees. So the popular committees, we'll also go through it quickly, but they're all really interesting. So the conditions that we just discussed, they large-scale alienation from the land, change in economic situation, etc. It led Palestinians to more and more start to develop a national consciousness and strategies around how to overcome the occupation. What we start seeing, throughout the 70s and 80s is the development of mass organizations that could at once provide the essential services that were not being provided to the Palestinians, and through these services also undermine the Zionist entity. Starting in the 70s, the Palestinian political parties and other grassroots organizations and efforts were attempting to address the conditions created in 1967 by politicizing the youth, by education, women's committees, volunteer brigades, volunteer work brigades, women's committees, medical relief committees, agricultural committees, and defense committees. One quick kind of example I'll give, I don't know if anyone's watched this movie called The Wanted 18. It's about these cows that Palestinian town during the First Intifada purchased in order to create their own milk, because they were relying on the town it was Bithur, it was a town, they were relying on the milk from Zionists, so they purchased these cows, and then the cows were declared a threat to the state of Israel. Like literally they had, Israelis going and trying to find the cows, they had defense committees trying to protect the cows, and it was, a way to sustain their livelihood, to sustain them, apart and against the Zionist occupation. And it was very successful. The Intifada lasted for 9 years. But it wasn't just popular committees that developed at this time. We also saw the growth of unions, labor movements, Palestinian wage workers, which were also informed like the popular committees. And importantly, we see the rebuilding of institutions, the institutions being built up that will then be destroyed and disintegrated with Oslo. And this is kind of, how we started off our presentation, talking about the importance of institutions like PACC, and other such institutions that can bring us all together to organize, to learn, to build a movement. So with that, really quick,
Oops. No, I was going to ask a question, but I just gave away the answer. So Palestinians are getting organized. They're working into popular committees. They're able to address their own needs without the Zionist entity being able to take advantage of that. So of course, when all of these things are lining up, how are Israelis going to respond?
By attacking.
By attacking that, right? By trying to break that down, by a massive wave of repression, as we've seen with every turn of Palestinian revolution. And so in this picture here, you see a family visiting a young man that was injured during the First Intifada, visiting them in the hospital. And he was being treated in a hospital in Jerusalem. So the tactics, that led to his hospitalization were incredibly common. There was very brutal Zionist repression occurring at all levels of direct confrontation with the youth that were rising up and resisting. And so, you know, again, obviously things way worse than this as well. And there are things that we continue to see, you know, whether it's like through trying to purposely maim or disable Palestinians, or trying to purposely, you know, imprison them, trying to purposely kill them, obviously too, but other ways as well that they were going after Palestinians to suppress this uprising, suppress the first Intifada. So some of the things, in addition to all of these, right, and ways that they were trying to maintain their control, is like instilling curfews, again, just like we saw in the 36 revolts, mass arrests and torture, tear gas, and these are things you might have seen pictures and things of like this from the first Intifada of Palestinians kind of making makeshift tear gas masks, and they're actually things that, you know, during the Ferguson uprisings here, we saw Palestinians send protesters in the U.S. tips on how to deal with tear gas, right? And things that we continue to see all the time of Palestinians making do with the conditions that they're facing and finding, you know, other ways to deal with it. We see in Gaza today, you know, they're creating their own little ovens with coals because the electricity and all of the gas is out, right? Or water filtration systems, you know, no matter how small, to be able to continue to fight against these Zionist repression tactics. You know, again, they continue to destroy agriculture, destroy homes, telecommunications outages, again, things that we continue to see today, ways that they're trying to break people apart, they're trying to suppress any waves of communication between people and trying to break them, honestly, psychologically as well. Including censorship, travel restrictions and deportations, shooting and maiming, like we've talked about. So again, really quickly, one of the prisons, we don't have time to get into it, but one of the prisons, a famous prison was the Ansar 3, where many Palestinians were detained to. It's in the Naqab, and it's on the border with Egypt. I'm sorry, I'm going through this very fast, but kind of shifting into the next section, right? And something again we've talked about throughout this presentation, but it's important to understand here especially, right? So the first Intifada is gaining traction. You know, Palestinians are rising up. There's mass mobilizations. So this causes issues, not just for the Zionists, right? Not just for Israel, but for who else?
The U.S.
The U.S. Yeah. Was that what you were gonna say?
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Who else does this cause? If Palestinians are mobilizing, they're organizing, they're pushing back against the Zionist entity, who is this going to cause a problem for?
The British.
Yeah. The U.S. or the British are really the imperial forces, right? These capitalist forces that, again, just like they did in the early 1900s, just like they do to this day, they benefit off of the occupation of Palestine. They have investments in this land. They have companies in this land. And obviously, those are the small examples, but more than that, we've talked about the seaports, we've talked about access to land, access to Asia, access to the canal, and so on. And so, of course, they're going to try to respond as well, just like we're seeing now, right? Why is the entire colonial West rising up against Palestine, rising up against Gaza to protect their interests right now, right? And just like they did in the first Intifada as well, they realized, okay, it's not just a problem for the Zionists that are on the land. We have to get involved as well. We have to make sure that we can control our interests and secure our interests in the region. And we have to quell this Intifada. We have to quell this revolution. We can't let it be that the masses think that they really have the power, because we know that we do, right? So we see here, against the backdrop of all of this, this really lays the groundwork for the Oslo Accords. And the Oslo Accords, go to the next slide, actually. So, you know, some of these things that we just talked about here, before I get into that, actually, you know, is these forces really combining around each other, right? The U.S. government and the Zionist regime realizing that their interests are implicated here, right? The reactionary forces. This is now, we're past them recognizing the state of Israel, right? So they also now have investments too. They're realizing that their governments are propped up by the West, and if there's mass mobilizations in Palestine, it's not too long before there could be mass mobilizations in Jordan and Egypt and so on. And so again, we're seeing kind of these forces realizing, we will lose our power if this revolution is successful. And of course, as we've seen since the beginning as well, the elites are capitalists that also gained, they don't want the status quo to change either, because they've gained wealth and prosperity through these processes. Obviously, there's always people that will take advantage, right? So we saw, big Palestinian elites that started their own companies that are part of the occupation, that built settlements and so on for the occupation. And obviously, if the occupation is dismantled, they're going to lose their money and they're going to lose their status quo as well. And so, it's always important for us to think about this too, that, when we talk about Arab unity and Palestinians rising up together, that we also have to think about whose interests are who would lose out in this way, and why are they working to repress us? And so, again, that very quick, but but moving on from that, that really lays the groundwork for the Oslo Accords. And the Oslo Accords are this agreement, right, that the U.S. kind of facilitates and says we have to come to this agreement. We can't allow for these revolutions to continue on, and it's a big capitulation, honestly, of the Palestinian elites at the time and the leaders that they agreed to this. They agreed to basically further entrench the occupation, further entrench the Zionist entity, all for the sake of what is called the Palestinian state, right? They're saying, you guys can have your own Palestinian authority, you can set up a Palestinian state in the West Bank, right? You can have these 3 sections. Actually, really quickly. So basically, it divides the West Bank into 3 sections, and it says you can have authority over these areas. We'll actually withdraw Israeli troops, right? But when they say withdraw Israeli troops, what really happens is they set up checkpoints around these areas. So now, not only do they not have to send their troops into it, they can surveil the areas from around it, and they have the collaboration with the Palestinian Authority forces, right? And it creates what we call security coordination, right? It's like, actually, now you have your own Palestinian Authority. You can control within these areas as long as you continue to be in collaboration with the Zionist army. And this will allow, it might have seemed like a Palestinian state at the time, but it allows for a continued, actually, oppression and control on Palestinian lands.
And the PA is actually trained by the Americans in Jordan.
So, yeah.
Do you mind showing the map of the West Bank on how, because it looks like a lot of people think they're little islands, so that they can see the area A, B, and C.
Yeah, can we pull it up after?
Yeah, of course. I'm just saying.
If you remember, yeah. Exactly. So basically, the area that we see as the West Bank basically gets kind of like further divided into these areas A, B, and C. But actually, we'll pull that back up. That's a great. Maybe at the end we'll do that map again. That shows the timeline. And so again, really quickly, what this means is, with the Oslo Accords, before Palestinians are fighting for national liberation, it's clear, right? Everyone is fighting for national liberation because we know that the only way to stop the oppression of Palestinians is for the land to be liberated, right? Now, with the Oslo Accords, it turns into actually a state building project, right? It shifts the mindset that we don't want, it stops people from thinking about the liberation of all the land and rather starts to think about, okay, how can we create our own Palestinian state? So what if it's just these 3 areas of the West Bank, right? And so it really shifts to promoting this route of continued collaboration with the Zionist entity, continued negotiations, and criminalizing Palestinian militancy, criminalizing any form of revolution. Yeah.
Yeah, and one quick example of how the Oslo Accords was never meant to provide any form of like liberation to the Palestinians is the fact that it resulted in over 500,000 settlers moving, like, settling in the West Bank after the Oslo Accords. So that's why we say it facilitated occupation. It made occupation easier in ways. It sustained the occupation in more nice, easy ways for America and for Israel. Yeah. Right there. Okay. I know it's 4 p.m. But are you guys down for like 5 minutes? We'll go over like Gaza a little bit, or if people want to leave. What's
Now we here.
Let's do it.
I don't want people to. So, kind of bringing us back to why we're learning all of this today. Our history is still very much our present. It's still very much helps us to understand what's going on now, and more importantly, how do we fight the structures of oppression. And so this is kind of thinking about the latest assault on Gaza, the latest and the most extreme. Why is the world, really the world waging a war on Gaza? And I think we want to sort of emphasize that throughout this history we didn't get to focus specifically on different historical moments of Gaza, but Gaza has always been the epitome of national liberation. In fact, when the Oslo Accords happened, Gaza was the leadership of Gaza was the only leadership to oppose negotiations, and they said no, we remain with the path of armed struggle as a legitimate path for total liberation. And so we see how Gaza continues to, and there was also, like we said, the spark of the first Intifada. And in the 50s, there were major guerrilla, actions happening from Gaza in coordination with in Egypt against the Zionists. And so that's why Gaza has always been a thorn in the neck of the Zionists, even more than a thorn, like something bigger. Sorry, I'm just trying. So yeah, like as we see, this 361 square kilometer land that is Gaza. Why is the world attacking it? Why is the world attacking just this small piece of land? Because its liberation, like we said in the beginning, threatens the interests of the imperialists. We talked about the imperialists. It threatens the interests of the capitalists. It threatens the interests of the reactionary forces, and above all, it threatens the interests of the Zionists, of course. Actually, an interesting quote, Yitzhak Rabin, one of the Zionist leaders at some point, said that he's in the first Intifada, he said, I wish one day I'd wake up and Gaza would just drown in the sea. It shows, yeah, exactly, it shows the threat that Gaza has always posed, that because it's as the epitome, as the belly of the struggle of national liberation. And in this presentation we talked a lot about this. Our history is a history of struggle. It's a history of a lot of mourning and also a lot of celebration. And hopefully we can come back maybe and do like a history of resistance at some point. But it's important for us to understand the conditions that led to the moment that we are in now, to historicize and to contextualize the colonial violence prior to October 7th. The Palestinian people, they've been subjected to colonialism and military occupation for over 75 years, for over 100 years, as we learned today. And Israel is an imperialist project. It's a settler colonial project. And for 75 years, Israel has been, over 75 years, sorry, Israel has been colonizing Palestinian land, demolishing homes, building military checkpoints, stealing our resources, invading and killing Palestinians' homes and surrounding Arab countries, and really destroying our region and our homes. And the state of Israel, the Zionist entity, was created through the violent displacement of nearly 1 million Palestinians and destruction of Palestinian cities and the massacres of Palestinian people. And so the violence that we are seeing in Gaza now is a continuation and an accumulation of the violence that's been ongoing for over 100 years. So we've discussed what the Palestinians are fighting against, but we also need to remember what they're fighting for. You know, they're fighting for liberation of their land and their people, and for return. And liberation of the land, we mean from the river to the sea, and we mean the liberation of, you know, surrounding Arab countries from the cancer of Zionism, and, you know, the world from the cancer of Zionism, because Zionism is not something that can operate peacefully anywhere. It's a fundamentally like violent and genocidal ideology. And so I gave a little bit of a history of Gaza's resistance, but you know, in 1948, it was actually the site of the first national conference. 1955, it was a hotbed of massive popular mobilization when Zionists attempted to displace 12,000 Palestinians into the Sinai, which is what they're doing again. They're trying to do again. There was popular mobilizations, huge protests, and actually Egypt, under the leadership of Gamal Abdel Nasser, helped form guerrilla battalions that would infiltrate. You know, they're not really infiltrating; they're entering to their homes that are right on the borders of Gaza, infiltrate into the towns, and it was such a nightmare for the Zionists that they really had to expend all of their resources. And then we set the first Intifada as well, and I'm gonna just go through real quickly. I mean, in 2005, the Israelis disengaged from Gaza, which, you know, wasn't really a disengagement. It was, again, a new form of occupation where they imposed a siege on land, air, and sea. And, you know, they actually did this disengagement because Gaza was starting to pose a demographic threat to the Zionist entity. There's 1.7 million residents in Gaza, and it was part of what they call the Zionist entity. And it was actually getting to a point where Arabs were going to be more than 50% of the population of the Zionist entity. And if that's the case, then it no longer is a Jewish state, and they kind of lose their, you know, credibility of being democratic. I mean, not that we ever believed that, but it made it harder for them to do that. So they kind of just like extracted Gaza out while still occupying it and controlling it, but they no longer had to account for the population of Gaza. And then in 2006, the Hamas movement comes to power through democratic elections. Of course, the Zionist entity and America are not happy with Hamas and their ideology, and so they wage a coup to try to overthrow Hamas, which came to power in the West Bank and Gaza, because it was democratic, you know, elections for the state of Palestine. They overthrow Hamas and they institute the PA in the West Bank, but they're unable to do that in Gaza. So Hamas remains in control in Gaza, and so Gaza is declared a hostile entity because it does not, it cannot be controlled by America and Israel. And so we see how Gaza here is a barrier to the, you know, achievement of the capitulationist Oslo Accords, to the achievement of imperial interests, and how it remained the center of resistance. You know, from 1948 and before 1948 until now. And just to kind of, you know, close off on this framing right now of you know, the Zionist imperialist framing of this as a Hamas-Israel war. It's really a very clear and blatant attempt to separate the liberation struggle from the 100-year history of it, you know, and also to separate it from the popular cradle that sustains Palestine's people resistance. And popular cradle is a term that's used to describe, you know, the support, the massive support, the popular support for the Palestinian struggle. And, you know, this framing of the Hamas-Israel war, you know, mystifies and obscures the true character of the struggle, which is a struggle, a war of the forces of Zionism and imperialism on the Palestinian people and their just cause for liberation for over 100 years. And yeah, actually, let's play this video because it kind of sums up what I'm trying to say.
تبعتوا لنا حملات طائرات، انتوا باللي عملتوه خليتونا فخورين بالاسلام. انا رافع راسي فوق انه كل العالم الظالم اتآمر علينا، ومش اتآمر بس بالكلمه، لا، بيبعتوا صواريخ وبيبعتوا طيارات وبيبعتوا حامل ناقل طائرات وبيبعتوا جند وبيبعتوا كذا وبيبعتوا جيش وبيبعتوا استخبارات. هالقد غزه قويه، انا افتخر اني من غزه، افتخر من هذا البلد اللي اتآمرت عليه ورغم كل العالم هذا اتآمر علينا وبساعد وببعث طيارات ودبابات وصواريخ ادوات البطش. انا افتخر وارفع راسي فوق عالي انه انا من منطقه في يوم من الايام كل العالم اتآمر عليها وكل العالم عرفها.
What is he trying to say? Like, what does he mean by this? What are people's reactions? Thinking about like what we talked about today.
You can create any weapon, no matter how strong and how powerful the weapons are, but you can never like destroy the spirit of the Palestinian resistance. I think it's the main.
Yeah, definitely. What else? Other
Proud of being on the front line against imperialism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, front lines against imperialism of the entire world. Any other thoughts?
I think it's also like where Gaza is and what it represents takes the attention from the rest of the world to this one area, and it's not by chance because of the value, and beauty and all the things that Gaza has to offer. That's the world is seeing.
Yeah.
I actually really love that you used this video of all things to show coming out of Gaza, because a lot of us are really feeling hopeless and seeing Gaza as just victims, and this is just to show you that that should not be our narrative. And I just love that you did that. That we're not, that the people of Gaza are not just victims; they're resilient, they're strong in the face of this, and we need to be hopeful and supportive, and we can't lose hope just based off of what we're seeing.
Yeah.
So like piggybacking off of that, understanding also that the West isn't strong because it's a military superpower. That's actually an indication of its weakness. So like watching the attacks on like the Palestinian population, the Gaza population, is an indication that the West and Israel and the United States isn't a strong entity, that it is weak and that it will crumble.
Exactly. Yeah. Perfect. I want to end on that note too, and yeah, exactly that. All the revolts and the repression against those revolts that we learned about today, and the one that we're seeing, the genocide we're seeing unfold in front of our eyes too, that's all a confession of the Zionist entity's weaknesses, right? That it knows that if it doesn't quell the mass mobilization of people, that if it doesn't try to quell this struggle for national liberation, that it will never survive, right? It knows that its doom is inevitable. And so, again, with this video too, we see that this is really, Gaza, the small strip of land, barely bigger than Manhattan, the power that it has to bring imperial powers to its knees, right? They recognize that. The U.S. recognizes that. The West recognizes that. Why else would it veto a ceasefire resolution? Why else does hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people across the country are protesting? They're promising never to vote for these people again. They're out there in the streets. Even Netanyahu is saying the protests in the West are hurting us. We're gonna lose support from our best friends, right? They're seeing that the popular mobilizations, the people are with Palestine, right? And it doesn't make, the conditions are undeniable, right? That Palestinians are facing in Gaza. It doesn't. The situation is unbearable. Of course it is, right? We all know that, right? They know that they have to make it that way to try to quell this resistance, right? And it's our responsibility. I'm not going to tell you don't despair because Palestinians in Gaza don't despair. I'm going to tell you don't despair because how dare we, right? They're trying to use all of the forces of the West against us, against the oppressed peoples of the world. It's not just Palestine, right? Like Ghassan Kanafani tells us that the Palestinian cause is a cause for all oppressed peoples of the world, all revolutionaries, no matter where they are, right? And they know that if they're able to, or rather, we know that if they think they can get away with it in Palestine, they'll think they can get away with it anywhere else. And that's why we're all here today. That's why we'll come out to protest no matter where they are, no matter if it's raining, no matter how long this goes on, right? To show that the people of the world stand with the oppressed peoples of the world. And in fact, we face, you know, what is it called? Many of the same things, the reasons they're oppressing Palestinians and other peoples in the world, right? A lot of those things are also have effects on us, right? When money goes there instead of to healthcare systems here, when money goes there instead of the education systems here, and people are seeing this, right? And the government is seeing this too. They know that it can only last so long for them to blatantly lie to the world and to their constituents. So I kind of rambled, but you know, I think this is really, if there's anything we want you to take away from all of this, is our history of struggle, our history of being oppressed and repressed. It actually comes from our history of knowing our strength, of knowing that we have a just cause, of knowing that the people together can't be defeated. And that's what we have to continue to carry on forward past this room. That's why you have to tell people, you have to bring them out with you. You have to, whatever it is, whatever you take away from this, we want you guys to stay with it, to stay in the struggle. This is what it's going to take, and this is the thing that makes them quiver. They're scared. The imperialist powers, why else would they carry out a genocide to this extent? They're scared of us, of our power. So don't let anyone tell you that we don't have it. It's quite the opposite. And lastly, again, you know, our demands as they continue to be is an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and all U.S. funding to Israel. And actually, we know this is, as we talk about this movement continuing on, these are the tangible things that we're going to continue to fight for. They're not just things that we say on the mic. They're not just things we say at protests. Lift the siege on Gaza. Free all Palestinian political prisoners. And free Palestine. Thank you guys so much. We really, you know, are so proud and happy to be here. We have a lot of Palestinian youth members in the back and us, and we'd love to speak with you all. And please sign up if you don't get emails and hear about our things. We also have a brand new Instagram page. If I may plug, if you can all follow it, it's at NYCPYM. Please follow us there. And tomorrow night, if you guys are ever in the city, I know it's a little bit of a trek, but if you're ever in New York City, we've been doing a lot of volunteer events, and we'll try to come out to New Jersey more often, inshallah. But tomorrow night at 6:30 p.m. at the People's Forum, it's in Midtown, so right by Times Square Station. We'll have a volunteer meeting there as well if anyone's interested in continuing to get more involved.
Is it PUM or POM?
PYM.
PYM.
Yeah. NYC
We
PYM.
just started.
Yeah. Well, we have an official page. Also follow that Palestinian Youth Movement, but we have a local page as well, NYC PYM. Yeah.
Thank you guys.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you guys for coming. Thank you, Lamis and I have just a few announcements of upcoming events here that we have really quick. So December 13th, we're having a virtual teach-in this Wednesday at 6:30 online. Next Saturday, December 16th, we have a political prisoners teach-in with Sami Doon. They are a network focused on political prisoners. That'll be at 3. December 17th, Sunday, Born in Gaza, we're having a screening and then a discussion. December 21, we're having the community family teach-in with Thoraya, who's decolonized the classroom, if you know her, at 6 p.m. And then we are starting our Freedom is the Future online course, January 9th, February 27th. It's virtual, once a week, and that's for 18 and up. If you are interested in a longer course that focuses on solidarity, we're also doing a book study with Jihad al-Muslim's book, Light in Gaza. December 11th, Palestine, if you're a writer, we're accepting literary submissions up until December 11th for our literary magazine. And every Monday night, we have support circles here. We have trained counselors that will be here 6:30 to 8 for anyone who needs just to come talk. We're having a media symposia January 7th, Tadris February 3rd, those are a little farther out. And then we have private group DEPCA classes if anyone's interested in doing that. We always have PACC workshops open for other to come into other places too. Again, I really want to thank PYM. This was a really great teaching, and I really hope you can come back for part 2 so we can get more of that inside this lesson. On your way out, we have PACC merch. If you want any Palestine clothing, we're selling those right at the door. Thank you so much for coming. If you could just fold your chair on your way out, it would really be helpful because it's Sunday. Thank you guys. Yeah, thank you.
I got a tote bag, and I got a matching sweater with City, and we got a sweater for Layla and Arthur. We got a sweater for Layla. Sorry? Yeah, we went to the park. Is it still recording? Oh, it is, City, and it's still recording. It's still recording. Wait, go in front of it. Say hi.